This is how empires speak. Not in whispers, not behind closed doors, but on camera. With a smile, a US president announces it plainly. 30 to 50 million barrels of oil. Another country's oil turned over. Immediately, no debate, no delay. The justification is even starker. We're going to keep the oil. I have reported on wars sold as liberation, on sanctions sold as morality, on intervention sold as necessity, but rarely has power been this direct, this unfiltered, this unapologetic. Venezuela's leader is captured. Caracas is placed under US control. And oil becomes the centerpiece of a new promise. Sold at market price, managed by Washington, claimed to benefit both nations. You are told this is pragmatic. You are told this is different from Iraq. Because this time, the oil stays. If you want to understand what kind of world this creates, follow closely, because once leaders say the quiet part out loud, history accelerates. And to see why this moment matters so much, we need to step back. Let me slow this down for just a moment, because headlines move fast. But power moves with structure. At the center of this story is not Venezuela alone. It is a principle: who controls resources when governments collapse, and who decides what benefit really means. The announcement was not framed as occupation. It was framed as stewardship. Oil will be sold, money will be controlled, proceeds will be distributed supposedly for the good of two nations. That framing matters because it shifts the debate away from legality, away from sovereignty, and toward efficiency, toward results, toward outcomes. Venezuela is no ordinary case. It sits on more than 300 billion barrels of proven oil, yet its production has collapsed from millions of barrels a day to a fraction of that. A country rich in resources and poor in governance. This is where the logic hardens. If a state cannot manage its assets, does someone else have the right to step in? That is the argument being tested here. Not quietly, but on the world stage. And once that door opens, it never closes the same way again. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to look backward at the machinery that broke Venezuela long before this announcement. To understand this moment, you have to understand the collapse that came before it. Venezuela was not always broken. It was once a major oil power, pumping millions of barrels a day, feeding the state, funding society. Then the system cracked. Mismanagement hollowed out expertise. Corruption drained capital. Extraction costs rose. Maintenance stopped. Infrastructure decayed. Production fell from roughly 3.5 million barrels a day to around 800,000. Oil did not disappear. Capacity did. This is how resource states fail. Not overnight, but through slow institutional erosion. And when oil states fail, oil does not lose value. It becomes more valuable to outsiders. Sanctions locked the system further. Isolation accelerated decay. The state lost control of its only engine. That vacuum matters, because power always fills vacuums. Sometimes with aid, sometimes with markets, sometimes with force. By the time Caracas fell, the oil industry was already on life support. Broken wells, idle refineries, lost expertise. What followed was not spontaneous. It was the final move in a long sequence. And the first real shock came next. When force met fuel, the first rupture came fast, strikes on the capital. Precision, decisive, unambiguous. Then the image that changed everything. Nicolás Maduro captured, along with his wife, flown to New York, not for diplomacy, for criminal charges. This was not regime pressure. It was regime removal. And immediately after, the message hardened. The United States would run Caracas, not indefinitely, but long enough until a safe transition could occur. And if it didn't, the warning was explicit. A second attack, larger, more devastating. This is the moment where oil stopped being background and became central. Within hours, the announcement followed. Tens of millions of barrels, sanctioned oil, transferred to the US government, sold at market price, proceeds controlled from Washington. If you're trying to understand modern power, pause here, because this is where force, finance, and resources merge. If this analysis helps you see the story more clearly, stay with me. What comes next explains why this wasn't improvisation. Because beneath the shock was a system already prepared to move. What you are seeing is not chaos. It is design, because oil does not move itself, money does not manage itself, and power does not improvise at this scale. The mechanism is precise. First, control the territory, then control the flows. Physical flows of crude, financial flows of revenue, institutional flows of decision-making. Oil is loaded onto storage ships, sailed directly to US docks. No Venezuelan intermediary, no domestic oversight. The money does not return to Caracas. It is held, managed, allocated by the occupying authority. This is the quiet revolution, not the seizure of oil fields alone, but the seizure of governance itself. Energy companies wait in the background. Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, they do not arrive during chaos. They arrive after order is imposed. Billions in investment are promised. Infrastructure rebuilt, production restored, profit resumed. But here is the key detail. Ownership and control are no longer the same thing. Venezuela owns the oil on paper. The United States controls the system in reality. This is how modern empires operate. Not through annexation, but through management. And once this machinery is in motion, it reshapes lives far beyond the oil fields. Because the next impact is not abstract. It is personal. Then came the second surge, quieter, but more dangerous. Because this time, it wasn't missiles. It was meetings. America's oil giants were summoned, not to speculate, but to plan. Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil. They arrived to discuss billions, to restart dead wells, to repair rusted pipelines, to bring Venezuela's oil machine back to life. On the surface, this looked technical, economic, pragmatic, but underneath, it marked a deeper shift. Once corporations move in, timelines stretch, interests entrench, exits become complicated. Rebuilding infrastructure means long-term presence. Long-term presence means leverage. And leverage reshapes politics. This is the second crisis, not explosive, but structural. Because once production rises again, the question will no longer be, can Venezuela govern itself? It will be, should it? Oil money will flow, but not freely, not locally, not without conditions. This is how dependency is rebuilt. With contracts, with capital, with clauses buried deep in legal language. And while governments negotiate, another group absorbs the shock more directly. The people. That is where this story turns next. If you are Venezuelan, this is not theory. This is your electricity, your fuel, your food prices, your future. You are told the oil will help you. That money will be used in your name. That stability will return. But you do not vote on where the oil goes. You do not control the contracts. You do not decide when sovereignty comes back. You feel it in smaller ways. Fuel availability, jobs promised but not guaranteed. Decisions made far away in rooms you will never enter. And if you are American, this still reaches you. Energy prices, geopolitical risk, the normalization of force as policy. This is the human cost of efficiency. Order imposed from above, stability delivered without consent, Some will feel relief, others will feel erased. If this story matters to you, pause here. Share it, because these decisions are being normalized quickly. And once people stop asking who pays the price always rises. What happens next does not stop at Venezuela's borders. It spreads. This does not stay local, because oil never does. When tens of millions of barrels move, markets react, allies recalculate, rivals take notes. This signals something to the world. That force can reset ownership, that sanctions can be followed by seizures, that sovereignty is conditional. For energy importing nations, this is unsettling. Supply chains feel less stable, rules feel less permanent. For oil states, the message is sharper. Control your resources, or someone else will. For rivals of the United States, this becomes a precedent. If Washington can do this, so can others in their own regions. With their own justifications, geopolitics hardens, trust erodes, energy becomes more political, not less, and the global system shifts again toward blocks, toward power, toward raw leverage. What looks like a Venezuela story is actually a signal flare for a world entering a more transactional age. And that leaves one final question. Where does this end? That is where we turn next. There are three paths from here. None of them are simple. The first is the optimistic path. Oil revenue is managed transparently. Infrastructure is rebuilt quickly. Production rises. A transition government stabilizes. Sovereignty is gradually restored. In this version, control is temporary. Power is handed back. Institutions are rebuilt stronger than before. This becomes a case study in rescue, not exploitation. The second path is the familiar one. Oil flows, money moves, but control lingers. Temporary measures stretch into years. Contracts lock in influence. Decisions remain external. Venezuela functions again, but not freely. A state rebuilt, but constrained. And then there is the third path, the darkest one. Oil becomes the prize everyone fights over. Resistance grows. Legitimacy erodes. Violence returns. What began as stabilization turns into permanent occupation by another name. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems built on control rarely dismantle themselves willingly. The future will depend on one thing above all: whether power remembers its limits. Because when oil defines order, order rarely defines justice. And that brings us to the final insight. I want to leave you with this. What you just witnessed was not a policy choice. It was a declaration of how the world works now. Not ideals first, not institutions first, but leverage first. We're going to keep the oil. That sentence will echo longer than any strike, because it tells every nation something crucial. Your resources are your shield. Your institutions are your defense. Lose them, and promises replace rights. This story is not finished. Venezuela is the opening chapter, not the conclusion. If you want to understand where power is heading next, stay with me. Subscribe, share this analysis, because the next crisis will follow the same logic, just in a different place. And when leaders say the quiet part out loud, history moves faster than we expect.